On February 23rd, 2020, a 25-year-old black man named Ahmaud Arbery was jogging near his home in Brunswick, Georgia. Two white men, Travis and Gregory McMichael, drove after him in their trucks and murdered him in broad daylight. Ahmaud was hunted down and lynched simply for the crime of running while being a black man. The two men would later claim they believed Ahmaud to be a suspect in a nearby burglary crime, a preposterous claim that would later show to hold zero merit. This was a racist and public lynching committed by a former police officer and his son simply because they knew they could likely get away with it. During the following months, the McMichaels would continue to live their lives as normal, without any type of arrest or consequence from their cold-blooded murder. Multiple prosecutors assigned to the case would recuse themselves and make it clear they felt there was no reason to arrest the two men. Three more prosecutors, and 74 days later, the McMichaels would finally be arrested for the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Later, the McMichaels would be convicted of murder and federal hate crimes, and they were both sentenced to life in prison. While some might say justice was served in this case, true justice would mean Ahmaud was never murdered to begin with. Throughout U.S. history, white vigilantes have formed armed mobs and hunted down and terrorized innocent, unarmed people of color. In his book, A World Without Police, Guiomar uses the term the pig majority to describe the police, but also those who exceed them as well. The pig majority includes the volunteer deputies, the courts, the judges, and the juries. Grand juries shield the police and vigilantes so they can walk free, while their victims are vilified by the media. The pig majority includes the mayors and the district attorneys who demand law and order and denounce those who protest police brutality. And finally, it includes the racist media, who bend over backwards to turn innocent victims into aggressors. They select righteous-looking photos for white aggressors, while their black victims are painted as violent thugs. This same media breathlessly reports drugs in the victim's bloodstream and any previous encounters with the law when discussing brutal murders at the hands of police gangs. White vigilantes in the U.S. have always been self-important defenders of private property and whiteness. They almost always act as brutal assistants to the police, and the line between the two groups is almost always blurry. The complicity of police in lynch mobs in up to half of all lynchings is well documented. Membership of police in white supremacist organizations has been called an epidemic. From the Ku Klux Klan in centuries past, all the way through to the racist vigilantes of the present, like Kyle Rittenhouse and George Zimmerman, policing has rarely been distinguishable from a white mob. As W.E.B. Du Bois explains, policing and white power are inseparable. He goes on to say that slavery in the U.S. demanded a special police force from the beginning. As slavery ended in the U.S. with abolition and slave patrols turned into police forces, being that these forces were originally arranged to deal with black folks alone, little changed, and the police assumed that every white man was a member of that same police force. Vigilantes and instigators don't always need to be the person who shoots the gun either. Sometimes it's as simple as calling 911. In addition to racial terror, the pig majority have consistently demonstrated that they are class traitors by breaking strikes and attacking workers. After the abolition of slavery, police patrolled the boundaries of segregated neighborhoods for decades, effectively keeping the black labor force on the plantations they had been freed from. Later in the 1970s, when poor and black workers were pushed out of labor markets due to deindustrialization, police enforced a violent feedback loop by connecting ghettos to prisons. From the very beginning, the police have been violence workers deployed by capitalists to maintain the racial status quo. Solidarity in this case means recognizing that police have always been about economic profit and racial control, and that they've always been strike breakers and a uniformed lynch mob. Now, when you tell the average person that we should abolish the police, their response will probably sound something like, "What about all the rapists and murderers? Who's going to deal with them? The simple truth is that the police don't protect or serve the victims of either of these violent crimes. Police do not prevent sexual violence and rarely even investigate it. For example, it was estimated that there are over 200,000 rape kits sitting untested across this country. Another study estimated that 5% of police officers will commit a sexual assault, meaning there are 50,000 predators walking around with a badge and a gun. Consent while in custody is quite literally impossible. Rapes committed by police take advantage of a massive power disparity between them and their victims. Not only do police not investigate sexual assault, they are commonly assaulters themselves. In the case of mental health services, police are typically the only option available for families or friends experiencing a crisis. However, because the job of the police is violence and not mental health, the results are typically catastrophic. A report from the Washington Post indicated that 1 in 4 police killings involve mental illness. It's estimated that over half of all Americans will experience a mental health crisis at some point, meaning that those experiencing a crisis are much more likely to be killed by the police when it occurs. Violent and abusive encounters with the police can also cause mental health issues, and this creates an awful cycle between the police and mental illness. When it comes to domestic violence, a study performed in the 1990s found that 40% of police officers self-reported abusing their partners or children. Domestic violence is estimated to occur in 10% of all families across society, meaning families with a police officer are 4 times as likely to experience abuse. This is the highest rate of any job occupation. Over 80% of police departments do not fire cops after being accused or convicted of abusing their families, and their service weapons are usually not confiscated either. If police departments were to try and fire the officers that abuse their partners, they would probably run out of cops. Because police are violence workers in service of capitalism, every situation they enter will likely be escalated or made worse. They regularly abuse their positions of power because they see themselves as being above society. They rarely face any type of repercussions for their violent actions either. Police do not exist to serve and protect, but to maintain the status quo through force. Given all this information, one might also come to the conclusion, why not simply try to reform the police or make them more efficient at doing their jobs? What we find, however, when we study the history of policing in this country, is that policing isn't a crisis of community relations. The working class is the clear target of its control. Making the police more efficient at their jobs simply means more violence and more oppression. Many of the so-called police reforms that are implemented simply end up emboldening the police to be even more blatantly brutal. For example, broken windows policing was originally implemented as a police reform. The type of knee-on-neck restraint that killed George Floyd was once held up as an alternative to using nightsticks. A perfect example of failed police reform is the advent of body cameras being worn by many local and state police. There's little evidence to show that body cameras make police less violent or that there is a higher level of accountability for their actions. Many times, the video footage of police killings that truly matters is the video taken by bystanders, not the police themselves. The footage from body cameras is typically not seen from a neutral viewpoint and is often used against defendants. One study from Temple University even showed a higher rate of civilian death among police that were wearing body cameras. One tidbit that truly tells you everything you need to know about body cameras is that a company named Axon that sells them advertised in one of their commercials saying, "When controversy hits, the public usually hears one side of the story. Make sure it's yours." Policing isn't broken, and police reform hasn't failed. Police reform legitimizes the police. While claiming that the system is broken, it distracts from its rotten foundations. The police cannot be reformed in a way that removes their violent nature. They will continue to act as special bodies of armed men in service of the state until they are abolished. National borders are yet another way of policing the international working class. When NAFTA came into effect during the 1990s, international capital was freed up to move across borders, while poor, displaced workers were criminalized at the same time. The establishment of the national border was always intentional in demonizing migrants while removing any leverage they had to struggle for fair wages. W.E.B. Du Bois explains that the buildup of a police force post-slavery was partially due to the myth that freed Black slaves represented competition in the workforce for poor white folk. However, the opposite was actually true, in that Black people in America being enslaved and being forced to provide free labor actually drove wages down even more across the board. The very same rhetoric is used today to demonize migrants. The argument is that migrants from across the border will drive down wages for the working class with unfair and increased competition for jobs. However, the opposite is true once again, in that border enforcement and policing forces migrant workers to seek under the table or off the books work, which limits their ability to organize and fight for fair wages. This plays right into the capitalist plan, which allows them to take advantage of an unfair legal situation that they created and perpetuate to profit off of the criminalization at the border. Without the police to enforce it, a border is just a line in the sand. ICE and Border Control uphold racist divisions between the global proletariat and help to weaken the working class struggles. Like the police, the border doesn't protect against violence, it inherently creates violence. Abolishing the police means abolishing ICE and Border Patrol as well. To conclude, Geomar says that to burn a building or a car is, like the riot itself, a form of communication. The George Floyd protest rebellion showed us a different kind of world. There was pressure in America and across the globe to defund and abolish the police. Abolition is not simply an against, however, it is also a for. Abolition approaches the task of dismantling oppressive institutions as an active process of rebuilding new and more human alternatives. A world without police would also be a world without white supremacy and a world without capitalism. To abolish the one means that the others must have been left behind as well. A better world is possible, and as revolutionary socialists, it is our duty to continue to fight for a world without police and consequently a world without capitalism.